We have been going through a number of basic kosher laws and concepts. We started by talking about bloods and checking eggs. We continued by speaking about milk and meat over the last few days. And finally, yesterday, I introduced the concept of a seal. And I explained that the rabbis instituted as a fence to prevent a person from sinning some rabbinic laws, which include that any foods, or not any food, but most foods that may possibly be substituted with a non-kosher food, if it is left in the hands of a non-Jew without a seal, becomes not kosher. It's nothing personal. It's not that we don't trust the individual, but rather if a person has no mitzvah to keep kosher, then he cannot guarantee that the food that, or we can't assume as a rule, we make a general rule that we don't assume that it is as it was. We often say that something may have happened, and we're not going to start differentiating between one person and the next. Rather, it's a standardized rule that food needs a seal. So let's get into the details now, starting with 16. Wine, meat, or a piece of fish that does not have a distinguishing mark that you entrust or send with a non-Jewish messenger. Certainly, if you send it to the non-observant Jew, interesting, he says certainly, meaning that the non-observant Jew sounds worse than the non-Jew. And he's coming from a perspective of a Jew that has left the faith, that he's not observant. He knows what needs to be done, but he's deciding not to do it. I think it's from a different perspective than today. Many Jews that have just grown up in that environment. But the bottom line is that anybody who himself is not particular about kosher cannot be halachically trusted, or it's not even about trust anymore. It's a rule. The rule is that any food that is left by somebody that is not particular about keeping kosher, Jew or non-Jew, needs to have a seal. Now, if it's something which may be mixed with a non-kosher product, which would be the case with meat or fish, so meat, you would never know the difference. Fish, if it's a whole piece of fish, a raw whole piece of fish, and it still has its fins and scales, so then there wouldn't be a problem because you'd be able to see that it's a kosher fish. As far as wine is concerned, when it comes to wines, we're particularly careful about wine. So those three things, wine, meat, and fish, need a double seal. Now, what constitutes a double seal? So if it has, for example, glad wrap, and on top of that glad wrap is a based-in tape, so that counts as two seals, because if we're a person to open up the glad wrap, it already wouldn't look like it was packaged at its place of origin. So you actually wouldn't need two based-in stamps, but you would need one. Really, in theory, you wouldn't really need any stamps if the two seals were seals that a person wouldn't be able to undo easily, based on where it came from. So if something is vacuum packed, for example, which needs kind of machinery, and on top of that, maybe there was another type of bag, that would possibly constitute as two seals. But you don't need actually two physical seals, but you need it to be closed with two enclosements. It could be one level of glad wrap or one paper bag or box, and on top of that box will be some tape which is being handled by the mashgiach, for example, if it's from a facility where the mashgiach ensures that kosher based-in tape is only applied in the right places and it doesn't go missing. Boiled wine, if it's already muvushal, or wine vinegar, or milk, bread, and cheese. So this is something where we're not really worried about it being mixed with a non-kosher product as much as it being mixed with we're not worried about it being mixed with a product which is biblically not kosher, but rather we're worried about it being mixed with a product that's rabbinically not kosher. As we know, as we've learned, the rabbis instituted that milk that is not supervised by a Jew is not kosher. Now, there is leniency today based on government sanctions, but putting that aside, if those leniencies do not apply, like if there are no such government sanctions, so then the difference between a kosher bottle of milk and non-kosher would be simply whether it was supervised. Since that's something that's rabbinic, one seal will be sufficient. The same may go for bread. Deliveries. So that's the rule, and it applies in all scenarios. If you send or entrust any of these items in a sack, it is necessary that the stitches of the sack be on the inside so that it can be tied and sealed. So if it's a bag that can be easily unraveled, so you want to put the part that could be unraveled on the inside and then close it over so a person wouldn't be able to just open it from the side and take out whatever they wanted and close it from the side. So it's the same concept. If you send a slaughtered animal or fowl or anything else without a seal on the package with a non-Jew, you should consult a rabbinic authority. So that what that would also mean is, let's say Moshe's butchery is getting a truckload of meat from the abattoir. So these are obviously still big pieces of meat before they've been cut up in the butchery. So that would mean that if there's no Jew on the truck that is transporting it from the farm, which may be 1 to 3 hours away to Moshe's butchery, then the truck itself will need to be sealed. So practically speaking, you have that phenomena. I was once asked to assist where there was actually a truck of some type of vinegar that was being sent to Israel, and they needed urgently somebody. There was a tanker, like these huge tankers that you see of petrol. So this was a huge tanker of vinegar, and it was being transported from South Africa to Israel. And whoever usually did the job was out of commission. And I rushed over to this factory, this vinegar factory, and had to climb the ladder and climb on top of the tanker and then get these special seals, which actually don't have a key. It just needs to be broken, and every seal has a code on it. And so I got my seals. The company has the seals around because no two seals are the same, but I had to take a seal and seal it myself, and then take a picture of the number on that seal. And then they took a photocopy of it and sent it off to the factory in Israel. And then the kosher certification in Israel then would have an agent there when the tanker arrives in Israel, ensuring that probably the truck's not going to end up in Israel. So I don't know how it works. I'm not sure. It probably gets emptied at the port. So I guess there must be another mashgiach in Durban. There's obviously a religious queue in Durban that then checks that same seal hasn't been opened, and then watches as they pour it onto the ship. And then on the ship again, they'll put another seal. So these seals don't just come in your little bag of schnitzel from Moshe's, but here we're talking about a huge tank, a tanker, a massive truck. And literally, I climbed up on top with, I think it was a series of ladders, but they needed me there in order to make that shipment. And the company is owned by Muslims, believe it or not, but they still have a kosher product, and they needed to get that onto that ship right away. So somehow, randomly, I came to the rescue, and all I needed to do was, my instructions were, drive whatever it is, 30 minutes out of Johannesburg. This was a few years ago. Climb on top of the truck, seal it, and take a picture, and that's it. And then my photo went on to the next stop, probably Durban, and then the step by step. So any food needs to be sealed to ensure that nothing is switched.
So who was the mashgiach at the factory?
In which factory? Where I went to?
Where they made the vinegar. And they put it in a tanker.
That's a good question. I don't remember the details.
Vinegar was made of wine, non-kosher wine, or how?
I don't know. It could be that in the manufacturing process, it's enough to have spot checks, but then there's still definitive points where it needs to be watched by a Jew. That's a good question. That's what I assume. I imagine that the way the factory works is that whoever's doing the rounds, the base obviously has a team of inspectors that go from factory to factory. So it probably doesn't need what's called mashgiach tamidi. It probably doesn't need a 24-hour supervision. Depends on the nature and the nature of the food. So in this instance, it seems that I assume that halachically, in the manufacturing process, it could be spot checked, but it still needs, but I guess as long as it's in the factory, then I guess they probably rely on spot checks. But the second the truck leaves the factory and now it's just going on the streets, and it could be anywhere. So I guess at that point it leaves the vicinity of spot checks, and that's why it probably needs the seal. That's what I'm imagining. It could also be that they have a CCTV. I'm not sure if they use that or not. Maybe there's a camera system in the factory. But I think that as long as it's in the factory for this particular product, spot checks suffice. And once the truck was on the road and it's out of people's supervision, it needed to be sealed. That's what I imagine. But it's a good question. Okay. So if you said to slaughtered animals, so I was saying the Moshe's trucks coming to the abattoir will obviously need the same thing. If it's not a religious driver, then before it leaves the abattoir, the mashkiach there will have to put on his seal and then send a picture. Or in the olden days, I guess, would call with the code. And then on the receiving end, they when it arrives in Moshe's butchery, there needs to be a mashkiach, which actually cuts open every seal of every truck. And before he opens up every seal, he needs to actually match it up to see that this particular truck, as it's logged in the system. So there's a lot more that goes into kosher than we think of. And this is another example, the whole process of seals. Okay. If it was sent without a seal, then consult the rabbi. As I said, sometimes there's another concept called tevios ayin, that it's recognizable by the eye, which I mentioned yesterday, that if you know for a fact that this product is the same product and it wasn't switched, not that you assume, but you know because you can recognize the actual product, then that would also be okay. It is forbidden to eat cheeses or other items that are in possession of a non-Jew, although they are sealed or stamped stating that they are kosher, as long as it is not known who sealed them. So that goes to the obvious thing that if you see a box of food on the shelf and on the box it says a K, which stands for kosher, then that's useless because anybody could have just written the word kosher. It needs to have a certification of somebody that you trust. So if you see that it has the based in symbol or the OK or the OU or any organization, then even if it has Hebrew writing, even if it says kosher in Hebrew, that doesn't mean anything. The Arabs that know how to read Hebrew and write Hebrew as well. So, and unfortunately, there are to date dozens, at least, maybe hundreds of certifications which are not reliable. So just because something is certified as kosher means nothing. It means as much as who the person was that certified it. So certain agencies already are well known to have a reliable board of rabbis that oversee the certification, and certain are less common. So many a time I've gotten messages from friends of mine overseas that they just came across this product and it says made in South Africa and it has this diamond on it and it says BD, and is that good? And it's great. How would they know? They've never heard of it. So I'll tell them, yes, it's a reliable Hechsher. But if I was living in Israel and I saw a product from South Africa with a based in stamp, then I certainly would not eat it until I found out who is the author of this, who is the maker of this particular seal. And once I did my research and I found out who it was, then I certainly would be confident to go ahead and eat it. So that goes for not anything that says kosher means that it is kosher. Especially in Israel, not good enough for it to say kosher. You need to actually see the certificate and see who it is stamped by, who it is sealed by, to know that what goes on is okay. Especially bearing in mind that in the food industry, unfortunately, there's money involved. Wherever there's money involved, there is corruption and there's fraud. That's the nature of the world. Any business that money is involved, there could be corruption. And so certainly products and restaurants and all of that are no different. If the guy's trying to make a buck, then he may very well be enticed to find a substitute of a product which is half the price, so you can make a lot more money. And you need to know that there's somebody that's there on site to ensure that it doesn't happen. That was all number 19. Moving on to 20. So care must be taken. Let not to cook or roast your food and the food of a non-Jew when the two pots are next to each other. So let's say you're on a holiday and there's a shared kitchen, and on the one stove you've got a pot of kosher food, your food, and on the next pot is the next guy that has a tent pitched next door you, and he's cooking up his non-kosher pot. So you don't want the two pots to be cooking right next to each other in such a way that it might splash from one into the other. If they're uncovered, if they're covered the whole time, then that's fine. Obviously, the same would go for milk and meat. If you've got two stoves and you use one for milk and the other for meat and they're side by side, then you wouldn't want a milk pot and a meat pot to be cooking at the same time while they open, because obviously things can splash from one into the other. You need to, preferably, if you've only got one range, then you should really preferably only be cooking one at a time, whether it be milk or meat, but not at the same time. Because if it's the same time, then there is a fair likelihood that you'll start stirring and tasting, and things can get mixed up and problematic. Same thing would go not to leave pots in the care of a non-Jewish maid when there's no Jew in the house, when there's no Jew going in and out of the house. So that's another important point. As far as your own house, as long as you're in and out, then that's not a problem. But if you're going on holiday for a month, and you're leaving your maid to take care of the home, and she knows you're not going to be back, then halachically you would actually need to seal meats or fish or things that could be substituted as a rule, because as we said, anything that is outside of the supervision of a Jew needs to be sealed. So these are quite practical examples. Another example would be if somebody is in hospital, and so they have their food, and so they want to put it in the fridge, right? That's what happens in hospitals. There'll be one fridge and everybody has their little bag of their little food. So again, you would need to seal your little bag of chicken or whatever it is before putting it into that fridge. Otherwise, unfortunately, it would become non-kosher once it was out of sight, unless when you took it back out, you were actually able to recognize this piece of schnitzel over any other schnitzel. That had somebody switch it, you'd say, hey, this isn't the piece of schnitzel I put into the freezer. Then if you have that level of familiarity, you can recognize it to that extent, then it would be fine. Thanks so much for joining. Please God, we will continue more about kashrus tomorrow evening, same time, same place, but different people.